Hello, bonjour, entente. I'm Paula Simons, Independent Senator for Alberta.
And I'm Ratna Omidvar, Independent Senator for Ontario, and this is Municipalities Unbound.
This series of roundtable discussions was inspired by my recent Senate inquiry into the role of Canada's municipalities in our federal system. And that inquiry was actually inspired by my friend and mentor, Ratna, who pushed, encouraged me to launch this venture. So I felt it was only fitting that she joined me as co-host to this panel discussion, which will dig into the challenges and opportunities Canadian cities face as they confront some of the biggest social issues facing our country today, from the crime and opioid crisis to the integration of immigrants and refugees to the journey of Indigenous reconciliation.
And we're joined today by a wonderful panel of guests from across the country. Mary Rowe is the president and CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute in Toronto. Mary and I know each other well because, after all, everyone in Toronto knows each other. Louis Cardinal is a member of the Sucker Creek Cree Nation, an Edmonton community leader, and the project manager of Edmonton's Indigenous Knowledge and Wisdom Center. Dawn Arnold is the mayor of Moncton, New Brunswick, the fastest growing city in Canada. Keren Tang is an Edmonton city councillor, a member of the board of Alberta Municipalities, and the past chair of the Edmonton Multicultural Coalition. And finally, last but not least, Kennedy Stewart is the former mayor of Vancouver, a former NDP MP, and the author of books including Local Government in Canada and Decrim, How We Decriminalized Drugs in British Columbia. Hot topic nowadays. So welcome to you all. Let's start by asking you each a question in turn. Simple question, complicated answer. What do you think is the biggest single social challenge facing Canadians' cities, especially the city you know the best? Mary, let's start with you, and I imagine Toronto.
Well, as you know, the Urban Institute's a national thing, and I've just spent 4 months living in Ottawa, and we're releasing next week an action plan on the recovery of downtown Ottawa. So I would say that my impressions are more vividly reflecting what's happening in the nation's capital. But I don't think what I'm going to observe is different anywhere else, which is the biggest challenge we have is untreated mental health. And this is, as with so many things, senators, thank you for having us, by the way. As with so many things, a lot of these challenges pre-exist the pandemic. And we've had mental health challenges manifesting in urban environments for a long time. One of Kennedy's contemporaries, when he was mayor of Calgary, Naheed Nenshi, tried to raise this and make it a national discussion probably 6 years ago, Kennedy. I'm trying to remember exactly when he tried to do it. But this is something that's been festering for some time. And now, during the pandemic and post-pandemic, we're seeing it on pretty much every downtown street, every corner, coast to coast. So I would say that we have to really be thinking about community-based responses to mental health and mental health supports. And that cascades into public safety, housing, economic activity. It just pervades the whole nature of urban life and collective life, particularly in downtowns. So that I would say mental health.
Mental health. Thank you, Mary. Louis Cardinal, does that resonate with you?
Apologies for that. We're seeing a lot of mental health issues within the Indigenous community, within the urban settings for sure. I think one of the outstanding issues that we have, and this is coming from an Indigenous perspective, of course, is the issue of relationship. Cross-cultural relationships are really important. During the times that we're facing now, we're facing a lot more direct aggression towards people of color and Indigenous people as well. And I think building on those and working on those relationships is critical in terms of how the city comes together and how the city works towards supporting each other. And while it's kind of lofty and quite broad, I think those actions and bringing various sectors of our communities together is a really important one for the cohesion of any urban center.
Thank you. Dawn Arthur, the mayor of the fastest growing city in Canada. What can you tell us?
Well, thank you. I completely agree with the previous two speakers. Those are huge, huge issues. But the way we've been looking at it, for us, it's housing, but sustainable, affordable housing with the proper wraparounds. That gets to the mental health components, that gets to the partnerships and the relationships. And I would say that we are very pleased with the Housing Accelerator Fund and even some of the demands that it has put upon municipalities. So,
yeah.
So housing.
Housing. Keren, Tang, what's your perspective?
Hi, yes, and thank you for having us. This is such a great privilege to be on this panel with everyone. Maybe just to add to the other speakers, I mean, it's the intersection of all of those things, the intersection between mental health, addiction, houselessness. We're really feeling that in Edmonton. I mean, infrastructure is major, but I think kind of underpinning all of these things, I find personally, you know, some of them major concerns around the deepening polarization in society. You know, I've found over time we've lost the ability to empathize with others. We've lost the ability to be curious about other experiences, making a lot of these conversations, whether it's mental health, addiction, or housing, much more black and white. And we've lost the ability to build that relationship with each other, to kind of find the common ground, and making a lot of these issues much harder to bring different partners together. So I mean, it's all of it, and some of the sentiment, societal sentiment, that is, I think, fueling some of the, you know, the division.
Kennedy Stewart.
I'd have to just first, I'd like to acknowledge I'm on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and thank them for their generosity to all of us here in Vancouver and the local area. And a great pleasure to be here today. I would really kind of echo what Keren said is I think it's a breakdown of kind of urban consensus and a drifting into polarization. And what that means, now that I'm a policy professor, what we try to do is identify problems. And, you know, for example, toxic drug deaths are spiraling out of control. I don't think there's any running away from the science of that. Homelessness is increasing, you know, all the issues that's spoken about here, you know, housing costs are rising, but even if we agree on the problems increasing, we don't seem to be able to get to discussions on solutions. So it's really drifted into wedge issue politics. People are looking to capitalize politically on deep social problems. Both sides, left and right, and that's not getting us anywhere, whether it's, you know, social problems or increasingly climate change, and I think that leads to a stagnation. And the thing is, you know, facts are facts. You know, if we don't tackle things, then whatever the issue is, they'll just worsen. And that's, I think, a lot of us, whether we're now engaged in governing in cities or living in cities, kind of feel that we're stuck and things get worse and we can't seem to get around the table to figure out how to make things better.
Yeah. Thank you all. That was a fantastic opening. Now, Dawn, I'll admit, I was surprised to learn that Moncton is Canada's fastest growing city. And I've read that part of that growth has been an influx of Francophone immigrants in particular. But I want to know, what are some of the challenges and the opportunities that all this quick growth has meant for your community as kind of a mid-sized city?
As you said, we've seen unbelievable growth. Like it, for so long in Atlantic Canada, it was really about managing decline. So this growth is just super unprecedented. And as you know, yeah, we are a bilingual city in the only bilingual province in the country. So we have a lot of Francophone newcomers that are coming here. 39% of our newcomers are from mostly Morocco, Cameroon, Algeria, but like cities across the country, a lot of our newcomers are from India, from the Philippines, from Nigeria, and they're filling in really critical healthcare roles. We have an aging demographic in New Brunswick right now, so we need these young people. They've changed our demographic significantly. The fastest growing demographic rate at the moment is between 15 and 29. So
wow,
this is massive change, and it's happening so quickly. So all of our systems are floundering right at the moment, I would say, but but the fact is that way more people are retiring out of our workforce right now than are coming into it. So immigration is absolutely critical to our future sustainability as a city and as a province. So, all the same ones: healthcare, education, housing, which are all provincial responsibilities right now. But at the city level, we're just seeing the need for like really serious investments in infrastructure, public transportation, all of that, and community gatherings places, so we can build that community and create those relationships that have been referred to.
Ratna, I turn to you.
Yeah, let's get to one of my favorite subjects in terms of cities. And I'm going to ask this question of Keren, because Keren, I understand, represents a very multicultural ward in Edmonton. And I have always believed, and I know, that when people come to Canada, they may come to Canada, but they will settle in a local community, and it's what happens in that community that sets them up for success or not. So here we come to the conundrum. It's the federal government that controls immigration and settlement funding, but it is the cities that do much of the work. So describe to us, Keren, what challenges does that present to you, and what have you seen in your city that you think others could borrow from?
Yeah, great question, and thank you, Kennedy, for reminding us to always situate ourselves. I represent Ward Garahio, which is in southeast Edmonton, located on Treaty 6 territory, and maybe I'll just start there for now. Ratna, you're right. We are incredibly diverse as a city, but in my ward, it's also lots of different kinds of people. And Louis and I often joke that even though I think statistically we may be the second largest urban Indigenous population center, but if you account for a lot of the surrounding First Nations, we might actually be the largest. Actually, in my ward, I think we have some of the largest urban Indigenous populations and residents in this part of the city. We have a fast-growing immigrant population as well. And often the things that I see, because it's a mixture between established and greenfield development, we see lots of examples of multi-generational families, people seeking bigger homes. It is also a ward. It is also a part of the city that has one of the highest concentration of social housing over the years. Much of the area was established in the 70s through a Housing First program to support new home buyers, and over time, the pressure around the expansion of the city, the inflow of migration. We're seeing a lot of pressure around servicing in terms of snow removal and turf maintenance, but in particular transit. One of the biggest demographic that I hear from all the time when it comes to transit are older Punjabi people who, many of them come to help take care of their grandkids and to support their families, so that we have a working parents. And then at the same time, kids go to school, they're hanging out in the parks, and they need to get to places so that they're socially connected, they're not isolated. And they actually become one of our biggest transit users. And in many ways, I'm trying to figure out how can we make sure our transit services are multilingual. We can meet some of those language demands. How can we make sure, many of them are seniors, how can we make sure the bus shelters have benches so people can sit while they're waiting? How can we improve our service frequency so people are not waiting, for a very long time and then get to their next social meeting place? And when we can't address some of those pressures, it actually benefits everybody. We're talking about better service for not just the seniors, not just the immigrants, but for all types of people. So I think that's one of the challenge that comes with a growing population, and I think that's a really good thing. That means people are coming to Edmonton. We are a place with more affordable housing market. We're very diverse. We're inclusive. We're doing some incredible stuff, I think, as a city when it comes to reconciliation, when it comes to anti-racism, as the city grows, as we do those things, how do we continue to meet the demand of that growth?
So Keren and Paula, forgive me because this...
No, you dig in.
You know, I want to ask you something, Keren. It appears to me that in your municipality, you have a high proportion both of immigrants and Indigenous peoples. Am I correct in understanding that?
Yes, absolutely.
So tell me how the two mix and mingle, because historically they have not. You know, and it's interesting. Immigrants and Indigenous peoples are the only two communities in Canada that are growing in population, and yet they don't seem to talk to each other. So tell me how that is working.
Yeah, and I'm sure Louis has lots of thoughts on this as well. I mean, this is an intersection that I've been very curious about for a very long time, even as a community member. You know, how our citizen naturalization process, how do we actually help the newcomers really understand Indigenous history and, you know, and pre-colonial history and change some of the perceptions when people come here. You know, over the years, I've seen lots of great community programs that really connect newcomers with Indigenous communities in terms of also shared learning, shared teaching, and people actually find a lot of common ground, especially at the grassroots level. And, you know, as a city, you know, we've really, you know, focused on a commitment around anti-racism, around truth and reconciliation. The anti-racism strategy was the first motion that our mayor, Amarjeet Sohi, had put forward, you know, right after the election, and it continues to be a major focal point. And we've also further, you know, dedicated funding and resources towards reconciliation, towards the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so, you know, and I think, you know, over time, I've also seen in many ways organizations that are focused on settlement. Some of those issues may overlap, but not always integrated as much. In one of the recent anti-racism, we've held a summit around this. One of the observations was that there is very few Indigenous people in the room. It's actually hard to have a caucus discussion. And when there is a caucus discussion around Indigenous issues, it's a lot of non-Indigenous people in the room, making it very difficult to create that dialogue. So I think you know, it's an issue, that relationship building that Louis was talking about has been around for a long time. I think we're only making incremental changes. And I think it continues to be this piece around our ability to empathize, our ability to be curious, and our ability to want to build those relationships.
So, Louis, I want to then pick up with you right there. You know, both Dawn and Keren have talked about the fact that, you know, cities are on the front line of responding to things that are often the result of federal policy, or often places where the province hasn't stepped in. And Indigenous issues are very much like that. I mean, as Keren said, Edmonton has one of the largest urban Indigenous populations in Canada. That population is very unfortunately overrepresented in Edmonton's homeless community. But Indigenous entrepreneurs and artists and writers are also such an essential part of Edmonton's economy and culture and identity. So how do cities as municipalities find ways to celebrate those opportunities while at the same time addressing the social needs of those who are struggling? I think you're on mute again, my friend.
I'll just leave it on from here on in. I think we have to remember, first of all, as our major cities across Canada, we're all built on traditional Indigenous gathering areas. You know, they weren't carved out of the wilderness, so to speak. They Indigenous people were already there. So in so many ways, Indigenous people are really coming back to those gathering places. And we're reminding ourselves what that means and the relationship issues we need to attend to as Indigenous people. And so with the work that we've been doing here in the city, building the first urban Indigenous ceremonial grounds, for example, in Canada, has really made a significant change already. Getting back to the question of the interaction between Indigenous and BIPOC communities or immigrant communities, it's offered us the opportunity to be able to bring various groups of people down from different cultural centers, from the interfaith community, for example, different churches. We've had Islamic leaders down there. We've had Jewish communities down there, synagogues. It's our effort in reaching out to the rest of the city's population. As our elders say, that we need to reach out now. It's almost 80% now of Indigenous people no longer live in their traditional communities, like a First Nation or a village or a Métis settlement. They're in the urban centers. And so that means there's more of us coming into the cities.
Yes.
It becomes an issue of racism as well, because we're still trying to undo those racial profiles that we have of Indigenous people. But we also recognize, we as Indigenous people also have those profiles in our head as well. So that means that we have to take the time to recognize that. But it all comes back to that relationship point. But we also need to be able to put a face on these issues. Often we talk about these issues like racism, discrimination, in terms that are a little bit abstract for the average person to really grab hold of. But when you put a face to it, it really does change the story, brings it closer to home. It taps into our common humanity and our responsibilities for each other. And so that also then relates back to how do we live in the urban centers as Indigenous people and maintaining our own sense of wellness. And by having these cultural ceremonial grounds, it's critical to that wellness, because up to now, we're the only people who have to leave the city just to do our basic prayers and ceremony. But now we don't have to, hopefully the rest of the fine cities will do the same across Canada. And there is growing interest.
So back to me, and my question is to Kennedy. We've heard from the panel about the issues dealing with mental health, cross-cultural relationships, addiction, housing. You've been a mayor of a big city and you've dealt with all of these challenges, but there is an elephant in the room, and that is the authority and power that the cities have or do not have. Do you think mayors and municipalities have the powers and the funding that they need to tackle all of these challenges?
The straight answer on that is no. However, I wrote an article a long time ago with a colleague, Patty Smith, and we were looking at municipalities that acted within their scope of powers and restricted themselves to that, and then municipalities that just took risks and went beyond their scope of powers. So weirdly, we called it beavers and cats. Beavers kind of slap their tail and go off and hide in their dams when they're in trouble, where cats can be perhaps more aggressive. So, but you have a choice as a municipality whether to be a beaver or a cat. I don't know what we were thinking when we wrote the title of the article, but so for me as mayor, I kind of thought my election, there was a split on the right. And so my election was a little bit of a fluke. I won by about 1,000 votes. So I kind of understood that early on and thought, okay, well, I'm going to take a lot of risks because I probably won't be back because the right wing will get its stuff together and come together. And that's what happened. But so when the federal health minister called me and said, hey, would you like to decriminalize drugs in your city? I said, sure. And then we kind of drove that process in British Columbia. What I'm not happy about the current debate around that issue. However, I am happy that we actually got to try it on the ground, and we have about a year and a half worth of data that the very good health scientists can look at, even if it hasn't fully disappeared, but it is restricted. It does give us information to work from. So that was kind of my thought. Try to build as much housing, rental housing in west side of Vancouver, kind of very wealthy areas that don't traditionally take rental housing. Try for police reform by calling out to systemic racism in the VPD and other services here in Vancouver. So my thought is, you can probably survive as a long time by doing nothing, and you probably survive politically a shorter time by being perhaps, maybe I was a little overactive, but I think those are choices we all make politically, unless you're a senator, of course, then you don't you don't have to worry about elections. So, but you can host great forums like this where we get to discuss these issues. So thank you.
Yes, we do like to host great forums. So I do have a question, a follow-up question for you, Kennedy, and it is this. There is a new phenomenon at play. Increasingly, the federal government is reaching over the provincial governments and dealing directly with cities on issues like housing, obviously, but parts of the carbon tax are being reimbursed directly to hospitals and schools.
Yep.
And in Toronto, at least, the federal government is very, very much at the table with the city on issues of housing for asylum. Do you think this is a trend that will be sort of slapped down by the provinces? Or do you think there is room to grow, and should we take some optimism from this?
Yeah, I mean, because I was an MP for 7 years before I became mayor, I knew Ottawa very well. And so when I came into office as mayor, I went to my city staff and I said, okay, let's go get money from the feds directly. And they said, oh, we've never done that before. It never seems to come through. So what I developed was pitch packages. Like, so on housing, I'd come up with 3 packages, like this is what we need funding for, get meetings with the minister, and they would kind of, they had strict funding packages, but they could play around the edges. And so I started that in 2019, but then COVID really accelerated all of it. So when we had massive explosions of folks living in parks, Medicine was able to deliver money so we could go buy a bunch of hotels. That was directly to us. We didn't even have to talk to the province. And in fact, we, as in Vancouver, we kind of used it as a wedge to get money from the province. We would shame them saying, look, we're doing our bit, the feds are doing their bit, but you guys aren't doing anything. And then money started to come in. I think there's always been a tension in Canada, since the beginning of time between the provincial, federal, and municipal governments. And you're going to have periods where federal governments will do direct investment into municipalities. And then after a while, the provinces will try to intervene. It's a bit like the city of Vancouver, about 50% of their budget used to be from provincial grants. And that's zero now. So in the past, when the federal government gave money to municipalities, the province would just kind of steal it out of the back end by reducing the grants. But the provinces don't really have the ability to do that anymore. So I'm sorry to see what you're seeing in Alberta is the threat of just...
Don't even get me started.
Yeah, the threat of just saying, we just don't want your money, which again speaks to the problem of not identifying problems, not identifying what the solutions are, and who's willing to jump in where. So I think that's very unfortunate. I think it occurs on both sides of the spectrum myself. The left seems unwilling to listen to people that are hurting or scared, and the right seems to be, wanting to build political capital often. So for me, I think you should be activist municipalities. You should go after stuff wherever you can get it, international, national, provincial, local, corporate, nonprofit, because you don't have a lot of time and you've got a hill of problems to deal with. And also I would rotate the problem. So if the feds came to me with some pitch, it was something I wasn't that interested in, I'm like, okay, I'll do that just so we can get that investment. So, but I do think it depends on who's in charge in Ottawa. And so, which we're all kind of, again, not my issue anymore, but I think we've heard threats of cuts, and that is scary.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly what's happening in Alberta, for those of you who are not from Alberta, is that the provincial government here has brought in legislation which would prevent any municipality for accepting federal funding without provincial permission. So it's, it gets complicated. And so I'm going to steal this question I had assigned for Ratna to ask Mary, but I'm just going to steal it because Ratna's asked so many good questions of Kennedy Stewart. So I'm going to ask Mary. We've just heard from Kennedy about some of the cat-like things he tried in Vancouver. But let me ask you the really big question. How do we structurally and politically give our cities the power and resources they need to deal with all the social issues they need to address to grow and thrive.
I put my hand up on that previous exchange because I have some thoughts on this. I mean, first of all, what Alberta is requesting is what Quebec already has. So,
Yes,
it
exactly.
is navigable. And, I feel like I see it from all sides. I think just part of the deal of when you run a national institute, but or a Pan-Canada Institute, I should say, is that you need to see it from all sides. And understandably, provincial governments are concerned about the federal government creating a dynamic where they exercise influence, which may or may not be in the provincial interest. But my comment on this, because we were involved in the early thinking around the Housing Accelerator Fund, and Kennedy and Don, I'll be interested to hear what your views are of this. I found when we were doing the consultations on what half would look like, we were talking to municipal staff across the country. And one of the things that we heard, and Keren, you may have actually been on that call, it may have been prior to you being a councillor, I don't recall, but one of the things that we heard from staff was putting extra conditionality on the Housing Accelerator Fund was going to help municipal staff be able to achieve some things around inclusionary zoning, for instance, that they felt would be very difficult to navigate locally with their councils. And that I came to get to a place where I felt like there are going to be situations where conditions attached to funds coming from other orders of government may in fact be an effective way of achieving certain targets that are going to be very difficult to achieve without the conditionality. So this put us in the crosshairs a bit, because there are advocates for the municipal order of government that want all the resources and authority to rest with the municipal government, and they want the province and the feds to butt out. And I guess I feel there's a middle space. So in terms of what you're asking, Senator Simons, I am not, although I'm surrounded by lots of people who feel this way, it's not my particular view around advocating for constitutional change. I feel, it's interesting, my colleagues, my counterparts in the US, which there are many that are running large organizations that are focused on solving problems and challenges in urban environments, and they say the same thing that we say, that there isn't a person working on urban issues in an American city that doesn't wake up thinking about what the workarounds are around the current organizational structuring of how decisions are made between states and the federal government. In the US, there's a tendency in Canada to think that, oh, they have strong mayor powers there, it's all a piece of cake. The states are, that the roles are clearly defined. So I'm not sure that this isn't, in fact, a challenge we have around governance generally. Urban life is not organized arbitrarily to conform within municipal boundaries. And so whether it's homelessness or mental health or climate or economic development or culture, these things seep and just like water, like a watershed, they behave in a much more nuanced way across a large region. And so my view is that the solutions to this have to be small g governance approaches and it's also not just about government. I feel strongly that what we all need to be doing is solving the challenges that exist in the places where we live. And that means civil society, the community, governments, business, the private sector, the labor sector, all of us, and the Indigenous community, as Lewis is so clearly saying, all of these factors are part of a large table. And that is an approach to governance that we're seeing in Europe, that we're seeing in the US. And I would rather we spend a lot, I feel like we just love to sort of wring our hands in Canada about the kinds of processes that we have in place versus actually just rolling our sleeves up and getting down to it. And that's where I've come to. It's a blend. You've got all the politics in there as well. Let's just stay focused on how we solve problems, address challenges, and make the opportunities happen in urban environments that we know could be much more inclusive, much more equitable, and much more effective, much more generative.
Yeah, that seems a more practical approach than constitutional amendment, which I think we all know would be a very, very long and likely futile process.
There are smart people, though, pursuing it, and God bless them, off they go. We're going to evolve as a country. Of course we are. But in the meantime, let's just figure out which lane, who's most effective, who's got the resources, who's got the tools, and then let's get on with it. That's my humble little rant. Thanks for indulging me.
That was a fine rant. So I want to ask a question to each of you in turn. It seems to me that there is a real tension in Canadian cities right now. I think there's a sense post-COVID, whether it's real or imaginary or some combination, there's a sense of rising social disorder, a lot of concerns about homeless encampments, rising crime rates, drug overdoses, carjackings in places like Toronto and Montreal, you name it. And on the other hand, and at the same time, there's a rising concern about social injustice, about the widening gap between the richest and poorest in our cities, which some of you have already addressed, about the continuing racism that continues to push Indigenous and minority Canadians to the margins. So I want to ask each of you in turn, you can think about this if you're at the end of the list, how do we give Canadians confidence that their cities are safe, while at the same time giving them a sense that their cities are just? And Louis, I'm going to start with you this time.
All right. And I think media has a huge part to do in this, because there are frontline storytellers, I guess you can say. People are looking to get more information and put it into a context. I think generally our general population is under a lot of stress. We're being assaulted on many fronts by a lot of changes that are happening very rapidly. And one of those changes is the growth of our cities. I think we're in unprecedented times. I think we're going through an evolutionary stages. How are we going to deal with this? Because not all that long ago, 80% of Canadians were living in rural areas and 20% in cities. Now it's all flipped around. And so how do we come together as a whole city to address these broader issues? And it is going to take time, of course. But I think that when we take the initiative to tell a story, because we're having stories that are not based on fact, that are very deeply emotional, and that we have to tell a better story as a city. We need more communication, not less. And we need our storytellers out in the front lines to be able to say, things are okay, even though there's a lot of attention played to, say, one violent act somewhere in the city. It gives the idea that we're surrounded by all of these negativities, and so we become insecure. And then if we don't understand our neighbors very well, we start assigning to them falsities. We start assigning to them conspiracies. So we have collectively, individually, and also through our media and through the city itself, more specifically, in how to get that word out and how to get that story out, that we are seeing some really good things happening. And maybe those numbers that are loosely being thrown around on the internet are simply false. We have to call those things out as well. But again, the issue for me is telling that better story of the city, because there's a lot of great things that are happening in our cities, but we're just not seeing those stories reach the communities in the way that we need to see them reach. Because when you change the story, when you touch the heart, the mind will follow, for example. So that's how we can create a stronger sense. And yes, we know the housing issues, the mental health issues, racism and discrimination, all those things are very real. But there's other things too that we can help the community to focus on and give hope back to our citizens.
I just want to come in behind Louis, if I may, and say that there's a whole thing out there called the urban doom loop.
Yeah.
And it feeds itself. It's a kind of outlet for crankiness.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with Louis wholeheartedly. There are all sorts, and I'm sure Keren would say this, and so would both Mayor Arnold and Kennedy. There are all sorts of examples of really smart things being experimented with, tried. Governments are trying to support things that are working. They're working at a lower scale, smaller scale to see if it will work. We did so many smart things during COVID. Look at patios, like it's a trivial example, but it's an illustration of the kind of resourcefulness that we did in terms of delivering services more quickly, responding to people more quickly, neighbors reaching out to each other more quickly, incubating businesses. I just this morning had a coffee in a little place that's now co-locating with a real estate brokerage. Like, how smart is that? You go into a shared space and there's 2 or 3 vendors in there, and it makes the street vibrant, and people have a coffee and then they do some business. And there's a gazillion of these good examples. And I couldn't agree with you more, Louis. It's a Canadian preoccupation, and particularly when we start comparing ourselves to other places and we start to say, oh, we don't measure up, we don't this. Good heavens, look at the resources we have. Phenomenal. Anyway, second rant.
Excellent rant. All right, Dawn, I want to ask you this question. I mean, you're in the driver's seat as mayor of Moncton. So how do you, maybe that makes it sound like more strong Mary than it is, but you know what I mean? You're a serving mayor. How do you give, at a time when your city is changing so much and becoming much more multicultural, how do you give the people of Moncton the sense that their city is safe and just at the same time?
Such a good question. But first, Mary, I could listen to you rant all day. That's great. I love it. Wow. Leading by example. Number one, I bike everywhere, and you see the city in a completely different way
Yes.
when you're biking, when you have the opportunity to stop and talk to people rather than flipping them the finger when you're stuck in traffic and construction and that sort of thing. So I think that's a big one. But we're, as everyone's alluded to, like the storytelling. Oh my goodness, Lewis, that is such a big part of it, because it's right now we're living in this outrage and optimism. And how do we make sense of the two of them? And I'd like to give a call out to our Governor General. I thought that her messaging recently about how we deal with, what did she call it? Constructive disagreement, meeting animosity with curiosity. This is what we have to do. And I think as leaders, we have to be, leading those conversations, telling the stories in different ways, expanding on those positive ones, because there is so much that is positive right now. 2 days ago, I had Youth Fest. It's, I have 100 kids from all of our high schools here. We debate real topics. We debated whether we should lower the voting age to 16. We debated just all kinds of different topics. But the kids were engaged, and they are hungry for these conversations, and they want to be part of it. They don't want to just hear the doom and gloom, that urban doom loop. They don't want that. They want to step up. They want to be part of it, but they need help, and they need people like us to bring them into the fold to have those conversations. So that's what we're doing here, and it seems to be working, not perfectly, but it's a process.
Kennedy, I know that in Vancouver, I mean, in the wake of the election, there was a lot of stress and tension in the city about homeless encampments and fear of them. And the current mayor had those encampments cleared, which is a very temporary situation. And at the same time, I mean, a young RCMP officer, a young woman was stabbed to death working in an encampment. So, I mean, how do you figure out how to strike the balance between giving the message that the city, is just, and making people still feel that they're safe in their cities, especially if they're suburbanites who don't often come downtown?
Yeah, I think it's a great conversation. The thing is to start with the facts, and Canadian cities are pretty well as safe as they've ever been. In fact, crime rates are way, way higher in the 80s. And they've come down significantly, but nobody wants to talk about that. And I can tell you who doesn't want to talk about it are the police themselves. They chew up so much of our municipal budget. We had a small tussle with police during COVID where we're saying, like, we had to do cuts to all departments. The police are not a department of the city of Vancouver. They're formed under the Police Act, and there's an independent board, but all their funding comes from the city. The province ruled that whatever the police request, the city has to give to them now.
Wow.
They have a $350 million budget and basically a voluntary board, which I was the chair of, to oversee this coercive institution that has the power to kill you. And now they have unlimited budgets, and they have turned into propaganda machines. They never give reports about what's happening with crime across the city. They do media conferences pointing out individual, during my term, it was all about stranger attacks, which ended up not being stranger attacks, but they would call them that and not correct. So we need independent oversight of safety in cities. We need boards that go through the required statistics and to tell people what's actually going on so we can have informed conversations, police are civil servants. Civil servants love to maximize budgets. They love to make their jobs, they're so important to our society, but they need proper accountability. And I think that this has not happened. we the police board that I was on had a study on street checks, which was interfered with through the course of it by the police themselves, but it still came out and said, you know, Indigenous Black people of color are way over targeted in street checks, but yet the police were reluctant to drop them. Like, we need to have serious conversations about why we're feeling unsafe. And a lot of it is from the institution that's supposed to, you know, help keep us safe, is driving a lot of this conversation. So I think we need to take the storytelling away from the police, and I think we need to put it in the hands of new bodies that are serious about dealing with facts.
All right, and Keren, I'm going to come to you as the final on this round. You know, you talked about transit use in your community, and I mean, Edmonton just opened somewhat belatedly the latest extension of its LRT, and I was really excited. And I heard people saying, "Well, I'm not going to ride that because I don't feel safe." So, you know, there are consequences when people don't feel safe on public transit, for example. So, I mean, as a city councillor, what do we need to do to make people feel that their city is both safe and welcoming for them?
Mm-hmm. And before I kind of get to that very specific question around transit safety, which we've put a ton of thinking and resources towards, I just want to say I'm resonating so much with what everyone's saying. I'm like constantly trying to bite my tongue, and you know, there's so much to say and so much to cover. And I just want to build on a few things, which I think applies, you know, on this very specific topic around safety, transit safety, you know, whatever that is, and kind of to some of the broader issue around city building. You know, as you're all talking, I'm thinking about this key point around storytelling. And when we talk about social issues, when we talk about transit safety, when we talk about the encampment, one of the frustration I had, you know, back in December and January, there's some very aggressive decampment that happened in our city. What happened was a lot of those folks who are living and experiencing a lot of these challenges were very much criminalized. They were portrayed in the public as criminals, and you know, there's a lot of gang activities portrayed by our government, by the police, by the media. By and large, you know, and I think there's a similar trend happening right now with a lot of the pro-Palestinian encampment on campus, who, by the way, are mostly young people, but being portrayed in this way. And I found that, you know, prior to being elected, I worked in the city. You know, I was very proud of this project that I'm going to give a shout out to called Recover, where we, you know, went on the ground and talked to people and developed over, you know, dozens and dozens of profiles and stories. You really understand why people are in the situation that they're in, you know, what their backstory is. You put a face and name, of course, given, you know, with permission, to those stories around poverty, around houselessness and addiction and mental health. And there was a time that I've never seen so much hearts and minds changed, because they made these massive, complex challenges so human. And we are not really doing that as much. You know, I think back in January, I think the media did some of that, but by and large, that's not what we focus on in policy development. We don't really focus on the lived experience of folks who are really being impacted by these issues. It doesn't matter which level of government. And I think when we stop doing that, we create fear, we create a lot of the division. But when we bring that story, that humanness back, we helped to actually change the perception of safety. That's one thing. I think the other piece, you know, I really heard, you know, Mayor Arnold talk about is also this engaged citizenry, whether they're young people, newcomers, Indigenous people, and that comes from a strong local democracy. You know, when we had our zoning bylaw renewal, which is the citywide land use reform, you know, one of the most progressive land reform in the country, we have the biggest turnout of public speakers, not quite as big as Calgary and their marathon of 16-day, you know, 1,000 speakers, but we had over 200 people, nearly 300 people registered. And it was around 50-50. And we saw some really great mobilization of citizen groups on both sides of the debate. But we also saw some different kinds of people coming forward to speak about their experiences, whether they are newcomers, seniors, students. It was a huge demographic of young people coming out to speak, really changing the conversation about something that we typically hear a lot around. Well, densification is bringing criminality. They're going to make my neighborhoods less safe. They're going to devalue my property. But when we have very different kinds of people participate in these conversations, we really understand there's different worldviews, different lived experience. And it's not just so much focused on fear and crime and violence, but you start to kind of broaden our worldview, broaden that conversation to say there are lots of different experiences going on. And I think that strong local democracy comes with, a diverse representation in the elected form, but also in the, in the public service body, in who's engaging. All of that matters. And, just to touch on what's happening in Alberta, and I think local democracy is under siege right now. I'm very worried about future election. And I think that is going to jeopardize all these conversations that we're having, which has implications around safety, that, as you say. So around transit safety, when we have that wide, diverse representation at the local level, we come up with really comprehensive approaches. I think our council right now, we have the luck of being dubbed as too woke and too progressive. But quite frankly, I'm part of a provincial association representing over 265 municipalities across the province, rural and urban, large and small. By and large, municipalities are very moderate because we're practical. We're agnostic as to how we get to the end, but we just want to get something done, right? And our, and I feel very lucky to be part of this council that has such different views across the spectrum. But what that means is, at the end of the day, we don't have all of us saying, yes, enforcement is the answer. And as much as people push us towards that, we're very staunch around we need comprehensive approach. So we invest across the board. And I think that's what we need. And I think that's the kind of approach that helps to alleviate and helps people, come to the understanding that the issue we have is a lot more complicated, and let's break these problems down. And how are we addressing each piece of this safety equation? And one thing I will say, just coming back to the transit safety piece, one project I'm actually very proud of as well, that the city has invested, in a small way. Yes, we can focus on the social element of this, and we have resources deployed for that. We can address the criminality of some of the safety issue, and we have resources deployed for that. But there's also perception. And there's a project called Oracle that was really about engaging all kinds of transit users. And it's actually through storytelling to talk about, there's not just one type of transit safety experience on our LRT and on our buses. People talked about the moments of interaction with a stranger that actually made their day. Yes. A houseless person talks about how a bus operator directing them where to go for the things that they need, and what a difference that makes. We don't hear those stories. We don't hear those experiences. And I think when we do, we have a different understanding of what safety means. So that's my very long-winded way. I hope I touched on all the pieces, but I'm very passionate about this, of course. And I hope we can retain that ability to continue to tell very different kinds of stories.
Thank you for that, because it brings us to a very positive end to this conversation. Paula and I we're good friends, and partly we're good friends because we're both solution seekers, but we're also optimistic. So I want to end on an optimistic note. And we started with the social challenges, but let's talk about the greatest opportunities social diversity could mean for Canadian cities if they had the political independence and the resources they needed to succeed, or maybe even without those, because there are lots of factors at play. Mary has pointed some of these out. what do we do with the instruments we have at hand to take advantage of social diversity? Let's start with Kennedy, then Mary, then Keren, Dawn, and finally Lewis. And I will prompt you if we get lost a little bit here. So first to Kennedy.
Oh, you know, all human advancement comes from cities. So there's a lot of potential there. You know, Canada's featured GDP growth, all our innovation, everything is going to come out of cities. And you're only, you know, working at universities, you're always trying to pull together folks that have different ideas and have different backgrounds, and cities are just natural. That's what they do. I mean, I grew up in a very small rural area in Nova Scotia. And just fell in love with cities because, first of all, I couldn't understand how they worked. Like, how do all these people get along and, you know, go about their day-to-day life and then don't flee to the hills? And so for me, I've just loved cities forever, and just and they've always been places where diversity happens. I think of even, you know, Rome, the first city of 1 million people. Like, if you go back. So, but they've always been places you know, places of great change are also places of great turmoil. You know, you're making one day you're making money breeding horses. The next day, you know, the automobile's invented, and all of a sudden that whole industry disappears and a new industry arises. But that's what makes them so exciting. Exhausting places to live in and to govern, really tough. But you know, humanity's hope is in cities. Not to slight, you know, just in rural Nova Scotia visiting my mom, but that's a different way of living. You know, most universities are concentrated in cities, the medical research hospitals, most of the capital that drives innovation. And so we just have to take better care of them. I feel like, I really think that provinces in Canada see municipalities as kind of inconvenient things they have to deal with. You know, oh, I wish they just go away, but then they have to remember why they invented municipalities in the first place. It's because they couldn't do all the work. So you have to give the work, you have to trust other groups to do some of this work, like rezoning, and because provinces just can't do that. So as Alberta will find out very soon, there's a reason why you have empowered municipalities, because you cannot make all the micro decisions. So I you know, just despite you know, the problems in cities, they're better than they ever have been, really, in the history of the world, and we care about them a lot. And this forum and the comments I've heard here reflects that. So it's just hard work. Somebody said to me once, Dimitri Rousopoulos said to me about democracy, it's like washing dishes. You have to do it every day. You know, and I think building cities is the same thing. Like, you just have to get up every morning and do it until it's your turn to pass it along to somebody else. And hopefully they care as much as you do.
So another point of light and optimism, Mary.
Absolutely.
You know, I used to say, you know, Ratna knows this. I was in New Orleans for 5 years after Katrina, and I used to say, cities are unbelievably resilient. It takes a lot to kill a city, and part of the reason is exactly what Kennedy is suggesting. People come together for a whole bunch of reasons, and the desire to do that, like ants, we congregate because of the experience, the mutuality, and all the things, and that's going to continue. I always differentiate between municipalities, which I agree with Kennedy provinces kind of think, oh my God, what were we thinking? Versus urban, which is a lot bigger than just the municipal government. So the tenacity and the dynamism that exists when you put people in proximity to one another is just unquestionable. It's going to continue to be thriving the way an anthill is. I think the dilemma that we've got now is we need to invest. We need to be smart about how we invest. And that can't just be public sector investment. That's private sector investment, institutional investment, community investment, because we've got a big honking deferred maintenance, deferred infrastructure investment that's 60 or 70 years old. We're aging, believe it or not. And so, you know, you need to reinvest to create the conditions and then see what happens. And that's a sort of a fundamental thing. Let's invest in our assets. And I think the piece that you and both of you, the senators, are concerned about around social cohesion and what Keren is advocating for, and which they've worked so hard to do in Edmonton, and what I'm sure Mayor Arnold is dealing with as the city becomes more diverse as it grows, is part of the way that we work this all out is to have shared spaces. and shared functions together. We're on transit together. We're on the bikes together. We're on streets together. We're on curbs together. We're at corners together. We used to be in faith spaces. Those are adapting too. So we need to be investing in libraries and public institutions and all the things that bring us adjacent to the other, to someone who's not like us. And then we rebuild those social skills that are so critical to us living in mutuality. So I don't want us to underestimate that doesn't just happen by accident. You do have to invest around it, which is what I think a lot of urban leaders in every sector are doing now, doubling down on investing.
So investment and intentionality. Keren, your turn to leave us hopeful.
Ooh, okay. I mean, yes, yes to all of that. And I think this whole conversation, I can't, I keep coming back to this point I raised earlier around what that strong local democracy looks like. And a lot of the decisions that we're making right now, that diversity of experience, of views, of those who are elected, bring those forward from our constituents and those who are in the public service. I think it needs to really remain that way for a healthy, like citizen body. And things like that won't happen if we introduce, let's say, party politics. And I know that's the case in Vancouver, and I'm sure it's working for you in some degrees. But for us, we really, like, I see the challenges around that and changing kind of the dynamic. And of course, we have a very lively debate right now around our municipal, provincial, and federal relations right now in the city. One of the things that I am seeing that I think gives me hope is the amount of actually public conversation that's being had outside of government, outside of elected officials. When me and my colleagues, we go around and have our coffee meetings and go door knocking, people care about Bill 20, Bill 18, and it feels very like governmenty, very government speak, but people realize, people are learning about the implications. And I think the more conversations we can have, the more the changing narrative that we can have among the citizen body. To me, that's what gives me hope, is that perhaps, the bills will get passed. However, without the people working with municipalities, with cities, we can't, affect that change. So right now, given all that's going on in our province, in our city, I think the involvement of everyday people in their cities, in their politics, the big P and small p, that's what gives me hope.
Dawn.
Oh, wow. This is such a great conversation. Love it. What gives me hope? It's our newcomers. It's our youth. I do something called Moncton's Big Idea Contest with grade 4s because I love grade 4s. They come up with such good ideas, and so many of them are newcomers, and they have come to Canada for the boring things that we take for granted, like peace, order, and good government. And when I try to explain to them, the different levels of government, or to their parents and that sort of thing, they're like, that's crazy. And so I think that when they come with these new ways of thinking and new ideas and new expertise to our community, they're adding so much flavor and so much hope. And they're not willing to, like, that whole status quo. Like, I think that the newcomers that are coming right now are very different than the ones that came 50 years ago. These ones, they've made their decision, they've done their research, they want to be here, and they want to fix the system. So that gives me a lot of hope, because there's a lot of work to do in fixing our systems. Because right now, to Kennedy's earlier point about the beavers and the cats, the only way I get anything done right now with my provincial government is shaming them into it.
Lovely. Louis, for the last word on optimism.
Oh my goodness, I feel like I'm following the Beatles. I mean, you guys are awesome. It's just so wonderful to listen to all your thoughts. So how can I top that? Well, how can I add to it is my question, because you've all touched on a number of things I think are incredibly important and very hopeful as well. what I learned in working on a project called the Edmonton Urban Aboriginal Accord Relationship Agreement is that about 95% of people do not want to be involved in government, but they want to be involved in governance. In other words, they want their voice to be heard. And in many instances, we heard people say, well, I don't care if you do anything about what I'm saying, but I just needed to say it and I needed someone to hear it. So getting to the points that have been made, and Keren, you brought this up very well. Well, actually, you all brought this up very well, is that it's giving voice to the people, creating the opportunity for people to engage in a way that respects them. In my tradition, tacit agreement is not the assumption that because you don't say something that you agree. It's the opposite. If someone is not speaking and not saying something or not engaging, that means leadership or community leadership needs to step down and approach them and say, what do you have to say? Because every voice counts. And as you know, using that traditional symbol of the circle, all of the voices are very important because it might be that quiet voice that holds that piece of information that may lead to the solution that we're looking for. Because we have to remember that it's people that really make the change. And so by engaging people more in many different ways, not just at City Hall and not just, at other boardrooms and that sort of thing, but the communication needs to come down to the people. They need to be engaged together in a more meaningful way. And we need to find ways to support that because it's through that process that we're going to find some of the unique ideas. And as the mayor was saying, is that having those type of contests about great ideas and big ideas is really encouraging the community to engage. And it's from that we're going to see innovation. And as Mr. Stewart was saying, is that we know that the cities is where a lot of social changes throughout history have come from. And think of Vienna during the early 1900s, right? You have three distinct structures of governments that came forward to change things. So, but we have that still here. So it's the people and opening the door, welcoming them in and saying there's always room in the circle for you. We need your voice because you may be the answer we're looking for.
Wow. I want to thank very much our 5 panelists for this extraordinary conversation. I've been very privileged to have with us today Mary Rowe, Lewis Cardinal, Don Arthur, Keren Tang, and Kennedy Stewart. And my very special thanks indeed to Senator Ratna Omidvar, not just my co-host, but also the muse and inspiration for this entire endeavor.
Oh, gosh, that's a little too much. You've really done all the work, Senator Simons. This has been a fascinating discussion, the inquiry, and thank you so much for launching this inquiry and creating this roundtable series. Thanks, Paula.
Well, thank you, because you put me up to it. So, I mean, and for those of you who know Ratna, Mary, when Ratna asks you to do a thing, you do the thing. So it wouldn't have happened without you. Municipalities is Unbound and Municipalities Unbound is produced and edited by Caitlin Cummings, and this wouldn't have happened without her either. If you've enjoyed this episode, you might want to watch or listen to our first episode where we tackled the issues of infrastructure and housing, or our second episode where we talked about disaster response and emergency preparedness en français with my co-host, Senatrice Bernadette Clément. But please don't be shy. Like, subscribe, share, and keep the conversation going, and help us all to build the cities Canada needs and deserves. Thank you, merci, and hi hi.